The Mortician of Algernon, written by John Rennie. What we are making here is a kind of living death, Mr. Bremer said to Todd Haynes as he stood over the lifeless body of Miss Harmont, laying on the cold and grey steel slab of the mortuary table. We don't want to overdo it. It's our job to just do enough so that the mourners can see her in her final glory and have a final memory of her. Todd felt a little uncomfortable looking at the lifeless body of Miss Harmont, as she had been Todd's primary school teacher. Once she had been full of joy reading Charles Dickens to a class of adoring youngsters. Now she lay lifeless, with her skin the colour of the clay that Todd had once made dinosaur sculptures out of in her class. Mrs. Harmont had been important in Todd's discovery of literature. He couldn't help but feel a small sting in his eyes as he placed his thumb and forefinger on her eyelids and glued her eyes shut for the final time. The thought of working with dead bodies had at first spooked the hell out of Todd. He had always pictured morticians as looking a bit like Boris Karloff from those old black and white horror movies. He never saw a young man of his age at 19 doing this sort of work. After the first few days, he found that dead bodies were just like empty vessels. His job was to simply prepare them for whatever came next. Algernon, the town where Todd lived, was almost exclusively populated by folks of retirement age. It was a picturesque country town, and Bremer's was the only funeral service around, so they were never short of work. It was unusual for the town funeral parlor to provide the service from preparing a body to the burial, but it was a small town, and digging the graves and lowering the coffins meant 2 paychecks for Todd, so he wasn't going to complain. He enjoyed working on the arrangements with Father Steve at the church, and felt like he was providing a community service. He looked at it as seeing a job right through from beginning to end. Todd had a problem in that he was the youngest guy in town. Algernon offered nothing for him in the way of entertainment, or indeed any company of his own age. All of his small group of friends had left for the bigger cities after they had finished school, to work and to see the world. Todd never fully understood why he never left too. That's something he still had to figure out. After work, he would head down to the Milford Hotel, where he would get drunk on a foreign bottled beer called Frau Kolsch from Cologne in Germany. Drinking foreign beer made him feel more cosmopolitan. Every night he'd talk to the old boys and laugh at their stories from working in the mines before they closed and turned Algernon into a ghost town for good. There were monuments up all over the town to the glory days of industrialization, but to most who lived there, they were just gravestones and a painful reminder that this town, just like Mrs. Harmont, was now dead. This night, before Todd locked up the funeral home, he found himself alone, looking down at Mrs. Harmont and running his fingers through her silver-streaked hair. As he laid on the finishing touches of blue eye shade that she had worn while she was still living, tears began to roll down his cheeks. Mr. Bremer had always told him, you shouldn't feel any emotional connection to the people. Their spirits were long since departed, and they were just making the disposal of the body as peaceful and respectable as possible. Todd thought that was a bit cold, and sounded like they were taking out the trash. But Bremer had been at this job for a long time now, and was desensitized to the feelings that came along with it. Todd thought he was a stern man, but his heart was in the right place. Todd left the table and looked at Miss Harmon through his tears one last time before he turned out the lights. Walking down the suburban tree-lined streets between the orange glow of the twilight lampposts, Todd mumbled to himself, over and over, the words that Mrs. Harmon had spoken to him as a child in her soft and caring voice. It's all about respect. Treat others how you wish to be treated yourself, and the world will smile back at you. The words echoed in his head like a scratchy old record. Later that night, Todd sat at his usual place at the Milford Hotel bar, drinking his foreign beer. But he couldn't bring himself to partake in the usual laughter and chatter that helped cheer him up at the end of every day. He was obviously projecting that he wanted to be left alone, as most of the crowd let him be and didn't ask about his problems. As many beers as he drank, Todd couldn't seem to get Mrs. Harmon out of his mind. Every sip of beer seemed to bring back memories of the good times he'd had as a kid with her, learning his times tables, and for a reward, playing with the plastic cars in the sandpit in the play corner of her classroom. This just isn't right, Todd thought to himself. Mrs. Harmon doesn't belong on a slab. She belongs in her classroom. By the time that the bell for last orders sounded and the hotel bar was empty, Todd had made up his mind. It was time for Mrs. Harmon to give one last lesson in her class. Todd was well buzzed from the beers he had drank while he walked back through the deserted moonlit streets towards the mortuary. He smiled as he walked past the gravestone monuments to the miners and thought positively to himself about bringing some life back to this forgotten town. Happy memories of children's laughter and learning about how to be a good person echoed through his mind. Moving Mrs. Harmon was easy. He placed her carefully onto the wheeled gurney he and Bremer used to move the bodies around the building, and simply pushed her out of the door and along the sidewalks of the town as he headed to the old schoolhouse. The streets were solitary, and only the breeze of the night air kept Todd and Mrs. Harmon company. Such a lovely night, isn't it, Mrs. Harmon? Todd said as he strolled past the Milford Hotel. Maybe we should have a drink to celebrate the occasion. Without a single hesitation, Todd walked to the door of the hotel and tried the handle, but the door wouldn't open. I guess they aren't expecting us, Todd said as he smiled at the lifeless body on the gurney. That's no problem. He picked up a small round stone from the beer garden and gently put it through the small window of the door, then carefully put his hand through the broken glass and unlatched it. Inside, the bar was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerators. Todd took 4 bottles of his favorite foreign beer and put them into his jacket pockets before leaving some money on the bar for his purchase. There was no one around to give change, but Todd thought he could square this all up with the staff tomorrow evening. He was sure they wouldn't mind considering the occasion. He then headed back out into the night air and cracked open a bottle. Here's to us, Mrs. Harmon, and all the good things in life, he said as he took a swig, spilling beer down his shirt and onto the body. Todd drank the rest of the beer down in one and carried on pushing Mrs. Harmon along the sidewalk until he reached the old schoolhouse. The building, once vibrant, was now boarded up and in a dilapidated state. What children there still were in town now traveled to neighboring states for education or were homeschooled. But to Todd, in his inebriated state, the building looked sparkling in the moonlight. He smiled to himself and pulled a few boards from the front door in order to get inside. He took up Mrs. Harmon in his arms and carried her up the front steps. He stumbled a little in his drunken state, and the white sheet covering her body fell to the floor. Todd stood in the locker-lined corridor of the school, cradling Mrs. Harmon in his arms, looking for the correct classroom. "Here we are," he said, looking down at the closed and peaceful eyes of the corpse. "Classroom 1A, the place where it all began for us. Class will begin in just a few moments." Mrs. Harmon was stiff, and her body was rigid and cold. Todd stood her up on her feet at the head of the classroom against the chalkboard, which was now cracked and riddled with the cobwebs of age. He let out a sigh of relief and chose to sit at his old desk from childhood, right in the center of the classroom. He lifted the lid to his old desk and saw that the graffiti he had once scratched there into the wooden surface as a kid was still there. A small round circle, and inside the words now just barely visible, "The world smiles with you." It was Bremer who reported the incident to the police when he turned up to work the next morning and found that Mrs. Harmon was missing. It took the police quite a while to find out where they were, and they called Bremer to the schoolhouse to try and talk Todd down and persuade him to leave the classroom. As Bremer walked up the corridor, he could hear the echoing voice of Todd singing the old hymns that Mrs. Harmon had sang with him as a child. "He's got the whole world in his hands." Bremer entered the classroom and put his arm around Todd's shoulder and said, "Class is over now, Todd. It's time to go home." Todd looked up at Bremer and said in a soft and calm voice, "I always knew you had a kind heart." The ambulance was waiting for Todd as he and Bremer left the schoolhouse. As the van pulled away, Bremer asked the police officer, "Where do you think they'll be taking him?" The officer replied, "There's a psychiatric hospital a few towns over. I guess they'll take him over there for evaluation." "Well," Bremer said in a serious tone, "I'd better take the corpse back to the mortuary for the funeral today. There'll be twice as much work to do now Todd's gone." Bremer casually walked back inside, and the officer shook his head and said under his breath, "Goodness, you've got to have nerves of steel to do that job." Inside the ambulance, Todd kept repeating the same verses of the whole world in his hands as they drove down the road out of town. Todd looked out of the window for a moment to see the worn old wooden sign on the edge of the highway that stated, "You are now leaving the town of Algernon." The last sane thought to pass through Todd's head as he let out a sigh and left his sanity behind forever was the word, "Finally."